Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
Heather, so you were just able to travel back to Kandern, Germany a few weeks ago. How was it being back to where you had previously lived and served?
Yes, it was really such a gift to be able to return to Kandern. And, Kian, it's funny. I thought about the logistics for this trip, like, packing clothes. I knew it was going to be a change of seasons. So trying to make sure I had things for a little bit warmer weather and cooler weather and arranging where I was going to stay with a friend. But hadn't really thought a ton about the fact that I'd be back in a place where I lived. And it was those first 5 years out of university that are just so formative, like doing my first job as an adult, walking around the streets of town while I was there and then walking around the school, Black Forest Academy, where I used to work. It just all felt so familiar. And I hadn't thought about how nice it would be to visit a place that it still feels like home. It's not my home right now, but I knew how to get around. And, there's my apartment I used to live in and things like that. And also to speak some German again. So it was, it caught me off guard in the best way.
That is amazing. Even being able to go to a foreign country, which was going back to a foreign country where you could speak the language, is amazing.
Yeah.
It feels almost maybe like a homecoming to college, where it's not
Sure.
where you grew up, but it's a place where you've been for a long time. Everything both feels familiar, but also slightly different. There's different people
Yeah.
walking around campus, different people you see on the streets.
Yeah. Certainly there's a lot that changes at the school with staff that come and go. And also all of my former students have since graduated. So some of them are married with kids. They're in a whole new season of life, just like me. So in that way, it's different to go back, but there's still so much about that town that is still the same. And that was just great to see.
Today on the podcast, we are joined by Dr. Phil Dow, who is the head of school at Black Forest Academy, which we refer to as BFA in this conversation. Phil grew up as a missionary kid in Africa, and he has lived in Ethiopia, Kenya, Canada, the US, and the UK, and now lives in Germany with his wife, Catherine, and his 2 high school daughters.
Phil has a PhD from Cambridge University in the UK, where he studied the influence of American evangelical missionaries on U.S. foreign relations with Eastern and Central Africa during the Cold War.
We're talking with Phil about his book, which is called Accidental Diplomats: American Missionaries in the Cold War in Africa.
To be honest, this is a topic I really didn't know much about until I heard Phil talking about it. And it's been fascinating to learn about how knowing the history gives us appreciation for the work of missionaries before and also inspires us in missions today.
I agree. Let's go over to that conversation now.
Welcome to the podcast, Phil.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Phil, it is so good to have you on the podcast. We just introduced you as the head of school at Black Forest Academy, which is the first Teach Beyond school, but you also have a rich history of missions experience before even coming to BFA. In fact, it goes all the way back to your childhood. Could you walk us through a little bit of your upbringing and where you were born and how you ended up coming to BFA?
Yeah, sure. So Christian education, MK education, and me go back to my birth, actually. My parents were teachers at a school called Good Shepherd School in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 1969 to 1972. So that's where I was born in 1970. It was a school serving the missionary community. From day one, I was involved in MK education, and I didn't expect that would necessarily be where where my trajectory would take me, but it has. So, my parents left the mission field in 1978 to go back to the States for a few years to get some theological education. We returned to Kenya in 1983, and I joined an MK school called Roslyn Academy, where I was a student there. Left Roslyn because the school ended at 9th grade and went to Rift Valley Academy, which is a MK boarding school also in Kenya, which is relatively well known. It's been around for over 100 years now. So that is where I graduated from in 1988. I have wonderful memories of Rift Valley Academy. It was just a truly transformative experience for me in a whole number of ways, but in particular, in terms of my spiritual development and my vision for life and service to Christ through my life. So that was very important for me. Went back to the U.S. and Canada and did my education. Started teaching in the States for a few years at a classical Christian school, and then met my wife, who is actually working in Kenya with a group called SIM.
Mm.
And she was there. My parents were still in Kenya at that time, so I was back visiting them, and my parents made sure that we met. So it was a very much of an arranged marriage in some senses, but yeah, that's how we met and started dating. And then I decided that, well, if we were going to get married, then that needed to be in Kenya because that's where her work was, and I could teach
Uh,
anywhere. So I ended up going back and teaching at the same school that I started off in Kenya at. That's Roslyn Academy. So so I taught
mm,
there for 5 years. And then we left for some graduate school for me in England for several years, and then returned as their head of school in 2012, and I was there serving at Roslyn Academy for 10 years before God called me to come here and serve at BFA. So that's a whole nother story, but we are just thrilled that God has brought us here,
mm,
and that we get to be a part of a school that's doing work that we believe in deeply, and that is
mm,
um, serving MKs so that their families can continue to do the work that God's called them to, literally across the world. I think there's
yeah.
60 different countries that BFA kids' families are working in right now. So it's just amazing to be a part of a school with this type of global reach.
Mm. So it's really so neat to hear the story of how you grew up in missions and you've been involved in this kind of all your life. And I'm wondering what made you kind of want to study this from an academic perspective, to look at the history of 20th century evangelical missions and US foreign relations from that perspective, not just from this practical, I've lived it perspective.
The answer to your question is really I was had been teaching history in at Roslyn Academy for a few years, and recognized that I really wanted to dig deeper, to do my own research, to pursue a PhD, perhaps teaching at university level at some point. But I didn't know what I wanted to study. I love history in general,
Mm,
and so I came across a book. Uh, I think it was about 2005 that I read it, called "Special Providence" by a man named Walter Russell Mead. He's a very highly regarded expert in American foreign policy, international affairs. He served on the Council of Foreign Relations and a number of significant foreign affairs bodies. But so I picked up this book and started reading it. And it's actually about 19th century American foreign policy, but he outlines how Americans have viewed the world. And he had this, it's an excellent book, but he had this throwaway comment in somewhere in the book saying the hidden, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the hidden story of American foreign relations is the story of American missionaries. Um, and I thought, oh my goodness. And he said, and no one is talking about this. And so he kind of left it out there, and he didn't talk about it further himself, but he threw it out there as a topic that was rich that no one was looking at. And I said, this is actually a perfect combination of so many of my interests and passions. One, I've grown up within the missionary community. I have a passion for seeing that work thrive, seeing God honored through the Great Commission around the world. So that was missions was everywhere around me. But I had grown up in an international context, and so I was fascinated by international affairs and diplomacy. So seeing that these things could potentially have a significant intersection obviously struck a chord with me, and I said that is what I would like to explore. That is a PhD topic that is worth time and effort.
it's always good when you find that, right? When you're like, yes, I want to study this and this is going to take this further in a new direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was very exciting for me because I had been wrestling. Well, I wanted to study something that it would represent a new contribution to the field, but I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
finding a topic that was either new or engaging enough, and this was it. So I was excited about it, but there was a little bit of not hesitancy, but a little bit of skepticism that there was actually a story there, even though this well-regarded historian of foreign relations was making this comment. I thought that maybe he was talking about 19th century missionaries, but because I wasn't seeing that in a significant way in the 20th century. I'd grown up around missionaries, and I wasn't seeing missionaries hanging out with diplomats or presidents of countries, or
Uh-huh.
so I thought, well, maybe not. And But then right before I started applying to universities or for a PhD, I thought, you know what? In 1988, I was at RVA, Rift Valley Academy, and the school took a day off. This was, I think, somewhere in the middle of my senior year, because the president of Kenya was going to come visit RVA. Um, and and, uh, what struck me about that was we didn't think that was any big deal. Like, oh yeah, of course President Moy is going to come visit Rift Valley Academy. And then I thought afterwards, that's not normal. It's not normal for a president of a country to come to some obscure missionary kids school in rural Kenya, and spend an entire day amongst his very busy schedule. That's not normal. Um, but it seemed normal to us because we knew the story. And the story was that President Moy had been essentially came to Christ through American missionaries, had been discipled, in fact, actually lived with a American missionary family for a lot of his upbringing, was mentored, encouraged to go into education himself. They encouraged him to go into politics later. So basically, throughout his life, the president of Kenya had been deeply influenced, both in terms of personal faith and in terms of his career trajectory, by American missionaries. So I said, oh my goodness, this is exactly what Walter Russell Mead is talking about. But is this an exception? Is this just one story that stands out because it's unusual? Or are there other stories like this? And I said, there's enough for me from that story alone to begin to look into this. And if there's not a story there, well, it was a good try. But if there is a story there, I think it's one that's worth telling. So
As we are talking about missionaries, it's such a big topic amongst people who grew up in the missionary world or people who have served. And when I first started telling my friends that I was going overseas to be a missionary with Teach Beyond, my Christian friends were on board. They understood what I was describing, what I was saying. But my non-Christian friends, they were surprised missionaries even still existed. Missionaries were kind of a relic from history, along with colonialism and all kinds of cultural differences in comparison. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering how that, yeah.
And I feel like in my role in mobilization, we often encounter even Christians, believers who have misconceptions about missions and, is it being done well today and things like that. So,
I'm wondering if you can talk to us about common misconceptions of missionaries and how those views aren't necessarily always accurate.
yeah, no, that's a big part of my PhD. Really was battling with the preconceptions that people have of
yeah.
missionaries. Um, and I mean, I can share just a few of those. There's
Hmm.
more than just these, but I think the history books actually have a lot to do with people's misconceptions.
Mm.
um, when people hear missionaries, especially if they don't have much of a background in the church, they're going to go back to what they read in history, and they may reference back to the conquistadors of the Catholic missions, or they'll think of the British missionaries during the imperialist era of the 18th and 19th century. So most of the stereotypes that people will have of missionaries will come from the history books and those two big examples that aren't necessarily without blemish, shall we
Hmm.
say?
Hmm.
And the key tie between those two big examples, and of course there's others, is that missionaries were seen as an arm of the state, that they were used as kind of a means to political or economic power, um, and that it was kind of uh, a subtle way to get control over a region, and obviously that's associated with all imperialism and what people would see as oppression of the local people in the countries where these missionaries were engaged. So those are the key stereotypes that I think are pervasive throughout, certainly American culture, but Western culture in general. You add to this, the books like the Poisonwood Bible, which is a more current example, which is fictional but takes kind of some of the worst stereotypes of missionaries and combines it in one story, and a compelling story too. But that also is added to the stereotypes that surround missionaries, I think. So one of the reasons why I wanted to dig into this was also to say, what I saw, what I read in the history books, what I would hear from people who are outside the church, as they reference missionaries, was very, very different from my own experience growing up. I didn't see any missionaries. I ask some of my students here at BFA, how many of your parents uh, got into missions because of the access to worldly power or money, or have they gotten rich, or and they're all laughing, of course, because that's so far from their experience. So so when I looked around my own, um, the peers of my parents, the work that they were doing, what I saw is um, people that were there not getting wealthy, not in with the rich and powerful, not politically powerful or aiming for that. Um, and so, anyways, the reality was very, very different from the stereotype. But if you're listening closely, you'll see, well, wait a second, doesn't this contradict what the thesis of your book was? And that is that missionaries did have an influence on foreign policy. And the answer is yes and yes.
Let's take a short break for a story from the field.
Hello, my name is Tim Cocking, and I am the head of the Performing Arts Department here at Black Forest Academy, and I teach band grade 5 through 12. This year has been a pretty intense start. For a band director, most of my prep comes before the school year starts, so I'm working all summer getting ready for the incoming group, trying to figure out what material we're going to do, ordering charts, arranging, writing, making folders, making recordings, all the things that we're going to need to do to get class off to a good start. And then the beginning of the year is just a pretty intense push to get the train running down the tracks. And then after that, then it's just a matter of keeping the fires in the engine stoked and keeping it all under control. So this year I am most excited about my high school jazz and funk band. It's grown incredibly over the last couple of years, and I have 17 in there right now. I started getting excited about this year last year, knowing who was going to be in this year, and it's a wonderful group. I can't believe how well they're playing. We're playing some stuff that I introduced as kind of an aspirational thing a couple of years ago when I started the jazz funk band, that this is the kind of song that you're going to be playing, hopefully once you get to be a professional and through college. And I can't believe, but we're actually doing some of that music that I presented in an aspirational way just a couple of years ago. The thing that keeps me up at night with excitement and a little bit of pure terror is that we intend to take the show on the road and play out in the community this year. There's a blues jazz club in town that I want to take them to and play in the spring. And the logistics of that are a little bit scary with 17 people and 3 keyboards and 4 guitars and bass and drums and loads of percussion, plus the whole wind section. It's a big thing to take out of the school, and we are all really looking forward to it. But you can really be praying for us for that it would be a great community outreach, and that the students will look back on this as one of the highlights of their time here at BFA.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on the school where our guest today is currently the head of school, Black Forest Academy in Germany. To learn more about the school and current openings, visit teachbeyond.org/go. Would you say maybe the historical accusations are accurate? The imperial kind of Catholic missionaries or different ones like that are accurate, but then the more modern missionaries is just a different mold? Or how would you compare those two sets?
Yeah, so I'd say that there are reasons why the stories in the history books are there, because there's those stories are not made up. Like, there was a strong connection between the kind of worldly political powers and the missionaries of those eras for different reasons. Um, the story that I am telling of kind of post World War II evangelical missions in particular is quite different. And that doesn't mean that those missionaries were kind of morally kind of perfect in any sense. We know we've learned a lot of through hard mistakes in the evangelical missionary movement too, of course. But there's a number of very significant differences between those stereotypical historical examples and post World War II, 20th century and 21st century missions. One is that there is almost no connection between the missionaries that went out after World War II and the government. they were coming out, instead of coming from big mainline churches that were attached to um, or close to wealth and power, unless the United States or the UK. The American missionaries from that period were coming from generally small evangelical churches, in Midwest or rural, Texas or whatever it may be, and they're raising their own support. Um, they aren't graduates of Harvard or Princeton. They're coming from Toccoa Falls or Houghton or Wheaton or something like that. Um, and so they don't represent cultural, political, economic influence and power. They are going out because they feel God's called them to share their faith and to love their neighbor, which is what you could argue 19th century British missionaries were doing too. But there wasn't a strong connection at all between. There was in the British context, there wasn't in the American evangelical context. And that goes back to the separation of church and state in America too. There's all kinds of reasons for that. The difference is there is no intimate connection between wealth and power and the missionaries. And so that when they went there, they actually were doing the work that they said that they were doing. They were planting churches. They were translating the Bible. They were starting small rural schools or small rural clinics. They were outside of the cultural and political and economic centers of even the places they went to. And the places they went to typically were not at the cultural and political and economic centers of their regions either. So they were going truly to the ends of the earth. And so if they're going for wealth and power and influence, they went to the wrong places. They went to the marginal and to the poor and to the people that were outside of the cultural and political centers. So that's another significant difference in terms of the stereotype versus the reality.
Yeah, it sounds like you're acknowledging that missions is not perfect and that it's not always been done perfectly, but it's also important to realize that there has been positive impact and that it's not like, oh, that was all bad and done, but to recognize that even in the midst of imperfections, or while it was done imperfectly in some places, in others it was done in a better way, like to recognize that those coexist and that we can see God at work in that. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, no, and if I could, I'll tie that back to kind of the story that I'm telling in the book too, because really, I've said these missionaries, they went out to share their faith and to love their neighbor, um, and yet, and not to do that at the center of political power, and yet they end up having this massive influence. And the question is, how in the world did they end up having an influence in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia and the DRC? And they did, like they had. I could go on and about the evidence that supports missionary influence. Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya is one example. Haile Selassie in Ethiopia was deeply influenced by American missionaries, and American foreign policy was really dominated by that relationship between American missionaries and Haile Selassie. We see the same thing in DRC with some of the initial leaders of DRC or Zaire at the time were products of American missionary schools. And you can go on and on and on. But so the question is, how in the world did they influence? Did they have such a huge influence? And the answer is really because they simply were doing the work that God had called them to, and that meant sharing their faith, and people came to faith and they mentored them. That meant starting these schools so that they could read the Bible in their own language, and those schools produced these incredible African leaders in the initial period of independence. So yeah, so all that to say is, if the missionaries weren't doing something well, that influence would not have happened. But these people were deeply influenced, and what they were sharing was attractive to the populations in Africa that they were interacting with. And there was a massive turning to Christianity during this post-war period. I mean, if you look at the numbers of Christians in Africa in 1900 to the number of Christians in 2000, so over the 20th century, it goes from about, I want to say, 5% of the population in Africa in 1900 to about 50% of the population in 2000 of a rapidly expanding population base in Africa. So it's just been incredible rapid growth, especially post World War II. And where did this growth come from? Well, it came from Kenyans or Ethiopians or Congolese sharing the faith with each other, but that initiated in most cases, in almost all cases, from American or other missionaries, but the majority were American evangelical missionaries at that time. So they sparked a spiritual transformation on the continent of Africa that is really unique in world history. If you look at the spread of Christianity over the last 2,000 years, it really slowly growing throughout, obviously from Jerusalem and to Western Europe primarily, and then it goes into Eastern Europe a little bit through the Orthodox Church and Catholicism and so on. But really, the Christianity as a global faith has been a 20th century story, and that is intimately connected to the story of evangelical missions. And Africa is kind of the most obvious, glaring example.
That's so interesting to hear kind of the impact and the growth Christianity has had in Africa. And your book focuses a lot on missionaries' impact during even specifically the Cold War. But can you talk to us about how different countries in Africa were even connected with the Cold War? They aren't normally considered part of the West or part of the communist bloc. So how are these different countries related?
Yeah, you're right. People think of the Cold War and they think of Eastern or Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, and they think of Berlin, let's say, in the Berlin Wall, and it's a very European centric perception that we have of the Cold War, and that is true. But what happened at the end of kind of the 1950s, early 1960s, is that the Cold War in Europe really came to a stalemate. And Berlin Wall is a good example of that. And the reason was because there was nuclear weapons, and people were afraid that the Cold War would become a nuclear war and cause untold devastation. So there was fear on both sides. And what ended up happening is that Cold War conflict, or the Cold War competition between democratic West and the communist East, really spilled over into other parts of the world. And Africa became the unexpected fulcrum or hotspot of the Cold War, because at the same time, Africa was moving from being a colonial continent by and large to being a independent continent with independent countries. So between 1959 and 1963, for instance, I think it was almost 30 countries became independent in Africa. Um, and they were starting to say, okay, we are now independent. We can go our own way. Well, what is that way going to be? Are we going to, because the West is now trying to say, hey, follow the democratic capitalist path because that's what's best for humanity. And the East is saying the communist way is the way that you should follow. In fact, the communists were expected to be very influential in Africa because they were the philosophy or ideology of anti-colonialism. So everyone expected communism to be very influential in Africa, but the story ends up being the opposite, and actually the West ends up really winning the Cold War in Africa. And the question is how or why? And my answer to that is evangelical missionaries played a huge role in that, because of a whole number of reasons: education, healthcare, but really sharing their faith. So the Cold War spilled over into Africa, and it was particularly potent because of the decolonization time period in which that happened. And so Africans had to decide which way they were going to go. They end up generally choosing a pro-West path, and a large part because many of them were educated, mentored, discipled by American evangelical missionaries.
Well, Phil, I'm sure you have read and heard so many stories along the lines of what we're talking about today. So could you tell us maybe a specific story about missionaries who had an impact on a community that you're aware of?
Yeah, one story that I tell a lot because it brings together so many parts of the research that I did is a story of a couple named Don and Lyda McClure. Basically, their story sums up a lot of what I was talking about. And they left Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, in the 1920s to go to Ethiopia as missionaries. God had called them to this far off place, and they went and they started working among a rural people group in Ethiopia called the Anoak people, which are kind of along what is today the Sudan-Ethiopia border. Ethiopia was already, they were a long ways from Addis Ababa, and Addis Ababa was light years away from Europe and North America in terms of culturally and economically and so on at that time, is 1920s and 30s. So they go and work among this people, and during that time is about 40,000 people that made up this people group. They started planting churches. They obviously translated the language into kind of a written form. They did some Bible translation. They set up schools, clinics. They were incredibly high energy, high capacity couple, as you can tell. But over that 15-year period that they worked with the Anoak people, about half of the Anoaks, actually over half, became Christians. So we're talking 20,000 plus people came to Christ over that 20-year period. But not only that, they were among the most educated people in Ethiopia because the schools that the McClures had started, they were getting health care. So Haile Selassie hears about this remarkable change that's happening among the periphery of his country, and he goes and he visits the McClures out in rural Ethiopia, and he's just so impressed by what he sees there, and with the couple that they develop a close friendship. Don McClure and Haile Selassie become friends, and that friendship begins before World War II. And extends all the way up through the end of Haile Selassie's life. And every time that Don McClure would go into Addis Ababa, he would have personal audiences with the emperor of Ethiopia. Like, this is a regular thing because they were friends, but also because Haile Selassie had such a high regard for what they were doing. Haile Selassie was also, of course, a Christian. He comes from the Orthodox tradition, Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, Coptic Church. But he, through the influence of Don McClure and other American missionaries, really started adopting a very evangelical perspective on the Bible and on what it meant to have a personal relationship with Jesus. And he starts listening to American radio programs. He becomes one of the biggest advocates for Billy Graham's crusades in Africa. And Billy Graham has this huge crusade in Addis Ababa where the entire royal family is there listening. So this relationship with Don McClure and other American missionaries really influenced Haile Selassie on a very personal level. But significantly for my story, it meant that Don McClure becomes a key bridge between the American diplomatic community and Haile Selassie when Ethiopia suddenly becomes a very strategic country in the Cold War in East Africa. So the Americans want to have someone who can get to Haile Selassie and influence him, and Haile Selassie wants someone who can bridge him with American diplomats who he sees as a positive answer for his country. So these evangelical missionaries like Don McClure end up becoming a bridge. I made this comment in the book, like by the time Don McClure died, he was actually killed in Ethiopia in 1979, I think, by Somali bandits. But up until that point, he had, if you looked at his list of friends and contacts, he had American congressmen, senators, ambassadors, the whole royal family of Ethiopia, plus multiple people of significant influence in the Ethiopian government, other ambassadors from other nations, even including a couple of U.S. presidents that he had met and interacted with as a result of this. So Don McClure and Lyda McClure, this couple, symbolize this story of missionaries going out. And the title of the book, of course, is Accidental Diplomats. They didn't go out to do this. They went out to share their faith and to love their neighbor. But in the process of doing that, they end up becoming this bridge for American diplomats and African political elites. And it changes the story of African history during the 20th century.
It's so inspiring and encouraging to hear stories like that to remind us. I mean, I'm even thinking how we don't know how the Lord might use us in the places where we are and the relationships we've formed in the past. Where might that take us in the future? And just being open to his leading and not saying, no, that seems, too big or, too daunting, but to say, all right, Lord, I'm here and how will you use me? And whether that is in such a prominent position or in a small way, we're playing that role in so many different other people's lives. So that's really an inspiring reminder, Phil.
Yeah, and you know, the neat thing is, it was because they didn't care about political power that they were so influential. It's because they were
Right.
simply being obedient to God's calling in their life, that they were trusted because they weren't seen as manipulating or power hungry. So
Hmm.
that's to me a really encouraging thing, is they genuinely were just being obedient to God's calling, and God allowed them to be
That's right.
so influential
Yeah.
accidentally. I mean,
Yes.
not by God's, it wasn't an
Yeah.
accident from God, but it felt that way, of course.
Sure. Well, looking at where missions is today and going forward, we talked a lot about history. What encourages you most, Phil, about missions today and looking into the future?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of things that I get just really excited about when I see trends in missions. One is, I feel like we continue to learn so much from our experience, and the areas where we might have missed the way. We're Christian evangelical missionaries are actively working to repair or fix. But I'd also say it's super exciting to me to see, and this is something that I think Teach Beyond talks about a lot, is missions from all places to all places. And we just see the growth of the church in the global south. And what excites me is the future of the global south in the Great Commission, and figuring out ways that the churches in Kenya or Brazil or South Africa can have an impact in ways that maybe people from America or Canada or the UK couldn't have. So that's super exciting to me. It's just seeing how God is using people that were from receiving nations now to be missionaries themselves. So that's exciting. Having said that, I've just been looking at some research from Barna and some other places about if we look at American culture right now, over this last 10, 20 years, there's a lot of reason for pessimism in terms of the state of the church and theology and so on. But when I see some research from Barna saying, you know what, those Christians who are engaged in solid um, biblically rooted churches, their attitude towards missions is very similar, if not the same, of the attitude of those missionaries who went out, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's this deep commitment to the Great Commission it remains in North America, and there continues to be resources. So I'm optimistic about the continuing role of U.S. and Canada and countries that have been traditional sending uh, countries to continue to play a role, even if it looks a little different than it did, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
That's really, really encouraging as you shared. And thank you so much for all of the stuff all the things you shared with us about the historical role of missions and maybe some of the myths that are not true or inaccurate and how they've carried through today. And before we let you go, though, we have one question we like to ask all of our guests before we let them go, and that's what's one thing that's changing your life right now. So this can be something big and dramatic or something small, but you can kind of take it whichever way you want to go. So I'll start, so you have a little bit of time to think about it. And that is, I mentioned last week, so Phil, the last episode of the podcast, that we have a crawling baby in our house. And because of that, my office has started to fill up with plants because the one thing the baby likes to do is dig his hand into all the dirt. So we've moved all the plants out of the house and into my office because that's kind of the place that the baby can't go. So because of that, the house has lost plants, but I have gained quite a number of plants. So that's been fun.
Yes, I noticed that in your background, Kian, when we've been on video calls, but I didn't know the reason. And it's a fun reason. Phil and I don't have crawling babies, and so it's not something we have to think about. And that is definitely life changing. What's been changing my life lately, actually, it's a small thing, but I've been drinking from this mug that you both can see, but it's a mug from the pottery market in the town where Black Forest Academy is located, Phil, in Condern. And just recently I had the chance to visit for a little while, got to go to the annual pottery market, which was a highlight when I used to live there. And I had broken a couple of my mugs in the meantime since I lived there, and so it was nice to get a new mug or two to remind me of that place, but also they're just beautiful pottery. So that is what's changing my life this week. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, I number of things, but I'm reading a book that I think a lot of people have already read, so I'm a little late to the game, but called the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark
Yes.
Comer. Um, and I've just been struck by how relevant it is to life at BFA.
Mm,
BFA is a pretty busy place. There's a
mm,
lot of really neat things happening, but it's immersive and it's 24/7.
mm,
And recognizing that for sustainable health, spiritual, emotional, psychological,
mhm,
health to continue to do the work that we do here really well, we need to figure out how to regain margin,
mm,
and taking a positive critical look at how my day-to-day schedule is set up, and how can I find Sabbath, real Sabbath. So that's something that has been really encouraging to me recently, is that it can and does exist. And I just need to be disciplined to forge that.
yeah, definitely. That's a great one. Well, thanks, Phil, so much for joining us, for your book, for this conversation. And we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so people can check that out. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That was such an interesting conversation. It is fascinating to be able to reevaluate some assumptions and beliefs you hold, and also hear encouraging stories about the incredible impact faithful missionaries have had. Missionaries who had no desire for power or influence, and in fact, because of that, were able to have influence.
Yeah, that point really stuck out to me too, Kian. Well, Kian, Phil, and I all serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. As you've heard, education plays a big role in missions, and Teach Beyond is a part of that.
As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community, providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all He intends.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.